At 6:58 a.m. on October 25th, 1944, the pre-dawn stillness over the waters off Samar Island in the Philippines was shattered by a sharp cry from the lookouts aboard the USS Samuel B. Through the faint morning haze, four massive silhouettes loomed 15 miles to the northwest. Japanese battleships, their hulls cutting through the gentle swells with menacing purpose. For the crew of the Roberts, a modest destroyer, Escort, displacing just 1,745 tons, the sight was enough to send a chill down even the most seasoned sailor's spine. Armed with only two 5-inch guns and a handful of torpedoes, the ship was a David against the coming Goliath, manned by 224 sailors who had forged an unbreakable bond over exactly 5 months and 27 days since the ship's commissioning. Little did they know, leading the enemy formation was the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, a 72,000-ton Leviathan armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells over 25 miles, each impact powerful enough to split a destroyer in two. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, the Roberts' captain, moved with calm urgency as he grabbed the intercom microphone. His voice, steady but grave, cut through the hum of the ship's engines. "Attention all hands. We have contact with a large Japanese fleet. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, multiple destroyers, 15 miles out, closing fast on our task force." He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. "This is a fight against overwhelming odds. Survival is not guaranteed. Our mission now is to inflict as much damage as possible, to buy time for the carriers. We will do our duty." The words hung in the air, but there was no panic, only a quiet resolve. These men had trained for this, even if they'd never imagined facing such a fearsome adversary. The Japanese Center Force, as it was known, was a juggernaut. 23 warships with a combined tonnage of 200,000 tons, a fleet built for destruction. Pitted against them was Taffy 3, a ragtag group of 6 American escort carriers, slow, lightly armored ships designed primarily to hunt submarines, screened by just 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, including the Roberts. All told, Taffy 3's 7 small vessels weighed a mere 25,000 tons, giving the Japanese an 8-to-1 tonnage advantage. To make matters worse, Admiral William Halsey had taken every American battleship north overnight in pursuit of a decoy Japanese carrier force, leaving Taffy 3 completely defenseless off Samar. American intelligence had confidently reported that the Japanese center force was retreating after suffering heavy air attacks the previous day, but that report was catastrophically wrong. At 3 a.m., the Japanese fleet had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait undetected, their engines silent as they crept toward the unsuspecting American invasion fleet. Now they were closing in at 30 knots, far faster than the escort carrier's maximum speed of 18 knots. Outrunning them was impossible. For destroyer escorts like the Roberts, this was uncharted territory. Of the 53 destroyer escorts commissioned in the Pacific War up to that point, none had ever engaged an enemy battleship. Their doctrine was clear: protect convoys from submarines, stay out of the way of capital ships. The stakes were made even clearer by recent history. Over the prior 3 months, Japanese naval forces had sunk 4 American escort carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, with carrier crews facing a grim 40% survival rate in surface combat, a statistic that had claimed 1,200 American lives. At 7:05 a.m., Admiral Clifton Sprague, Taffy 3's commander, issued a desperate order. "Screening ships, attack. Buy time for the carriers to escape." 3 destroyers, the Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, veered sharply toward the enemy, their guns already warming up. The 4 destroyer escorts followed, the Roberts bringing up the rear. Time was running out. Japanese guns would open fire at any moment. The question on every sailor's mind was unavoidable. Would this tiny ship survive a suicidal charge against the mighty Yamato? Below decks in the sweltering engine room, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lloyd Trowbridge listened to Copeland's announcement with a heavy heart. Navy regulations capped the Roberts' speed at 24 knots, with safety mechanisms designed to prevent the boilers from exceeding their operational limits. Protections meant to keep the ship running reliably in normal conditions. But Trowbridge knew 24 knots wouldn't be enough to keep up with the attack, let alone survive it. "We need more speed," he muttered to himself as he stepped toward the main control panel. His crew watched in silence, their eyes wide but unflinching, as he began bypassing every safety system the Navy had installed: pressure relief valves, temperature gauges, automatic shutoffs. Each flip of a switch was a gamble. Pushing the boilers too hard could cause a catastrophic explosion. But Trowbridge and his men understood. On this morning, speed was the only currency that could buy them time. They would risk everything to get it. At 7:16 a.m., the silence of the battlefield was shattered by the crack of the Johnston's guns. Her 5-inch shells arced high into the sky, trailing smoke as they raced toward the Japanese fleet. The enemy retaliated instantly, and the ocean around the American ships erupted in chaos. 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo slammed into the water, sending 200-foot geysers of foam and spray into the air, shrouding the Johnston in a thick cloud of smoke. For a moment, the destroyer vanished from sight, and the crew of the Roberts held their breath. Had she been sunk? Then through the smoke, they saw her guns still firing, a testament to her crew's courage. 7 minutes later, at 7:23 a.m., the Roberts turned hard toward the enemy, her bow cutting through the waves as Copeland shouted, "Flank speed! All ahead, flank!" Thanks to Trowbridge's modifications, the destroyer Escort surged forward, her engines roaring like a wounded beast. The speedometer climbed past 24 knots, then 26, then 28, 4 knots above her design specifications. The ship vibrated violently, every rivet shaking as if the hull would tear apart at any moment. Metal groaned in protest, and steam pressure gauges spiked into the red zone, their needles quivering at the edge of disaster. But no one cared. In that moment, speed was life. Every extra knot brought them closer to torpedo range, and closer to a chance to strike back. The Japanese fleet stretched across 10 miles of ocean, a terrifying wall of steel. The Yamato sat at the center, her massive superstructure towering above the waves, while the heavy cruiser Chikuma led the right flank, 8 miles ahead of the battleship. The cruiser Tone followed 2 miles behind the Chikuma, her guns already trained on the American carriers. To the left, cruisers Haguro and Shakai closed in, their hulls slicing through the water as destroyers formed a protective screen between them and the carriers. The Roberts' mission was deadly simple: penetrate that destroyer screen, reach torpedo range, 5,000 yards or 2.8 miles, fire her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes, and escape. But getting there meant running a gauntlet of enemy fire. Japanese ships could hit targets from 25,000 yards away, meaning for every mile the Roberts advanced, the enemy could rain down 5 miles worth of shells upon her. At 7:32 a.m., the first enemy shells began falling around the Roberts. 8-inch rounds from the Chikuma splashed into the water, green dye markers in the bursts helping Japanese spotters zero in on their target. One shell landed 50 yards off the port bow, sending a wall of water crashing over the deck, drenching the crew. Another struck 20 yards to starboard, the blast wave rocking the ship so violently that sailors were thrown off their feet. A third shell hit the water 10 yards off the bow, the splash drenching the forward gun mount, seawater pouring through the gun ports. Copeland, his eyes fixed on the enemy, ordered sharp zigzag maneuvers. "Hard left rudder, hard right, keep them guessing." The Roberts lurched back and forth, her hull creaking, as Copeland tried to make it impossible for the Japanese to lock on with their rangefinders. Up in the forward 5-inch gun mount, Gun Captain Lieutenant William Burton and his 10-man crew were already in action. The crew, average age 22, had trained for 6 months firing thousands of practice rounds, but never against a battleship, let alone a heavy cruiser like the Chikuma. A well-trained crew could fire 15 rounds per minute, and Burton's team was among the best. Loader, rammer, powderman, fuse setter, trainer, pointer, gun captain, and 3 ammunition handlers, each man moving in perfect sync. But they had a limited supply: 608 rounds total, 304 per gun, enough for 20 minutes of continuous fire if they didn't conserve. 2 of the crew had never seen combat before that day. The other 8 had only faced submarines, which didn't shoot back with 14-inch guns. But fear was pushed aside by duty. "Steady!" Burton shouted as he adjusted the gun's elevation. "Aim for the Chikuma's superstructure! Hit her bridge! Hit her turrets!" At 7:38 a.m., Copeland's voice came over the intercom again. "Closing for torpedo attack. Stand by to fire." The Roberts was 7,000 yards from the Chikuma. Still too far. They needed to close another 2,000 yards, a journey that would take 2 more minutes at 28 knots. 2 more minutes of dodging enemy shells. 2 more minutes of staring death in the face. A single direct hit from an 8-inch shell would punch through the Roberts' thin hull plating, just 3/8 of an inch thick in places, like a hot knife through butter, detonating inside and killing everyone in the compartment. The forward gun mount's armor was only meant to stop shrapnel, not heavy-caliber shells. If a round hit the mount directly, all 10 men inside would die instantly. But the crew didn't hesitate. They kept firing, kept moving, their eyes fixed on the enemy. At 7:40 a.m., the Roberts crossed the 5,000-yard mark. Torpedo range. "Fire torpedoes!" Copeland shouted. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes launched from the starboard side, their white wakes slicing through the water at 46 knots, racing toward the Chikuma. The journey to the target would take approximately 2 minutes, and the torpedoes ran hot, straight, and true. Without wasting a second, Copeland ordered, "Hard left rudder! Full speed reverse! Get us into the smoke!" The Roberts spun sharply, her engines roaring in reverse as she fled toward a nearby smokescreen, desperate to vanish before the Japanese could track her. Lookouts on the Chikuma spotted the torpedo wakes, and the cruiser executed a desperate emergency turn to port. Her 8,000-ton hull heeled sharply, water pouring over her deck as her rudder was thrown to maximum angle. The first torpedo passed 50 yards ahead of her bow. The second missed the stern by a hair. The third slipped underneath the hull without detonating, a common flaw, as Mark 15 torpedoes had a 40% failure rate. The Roberts had fired 3 duds, but Copeland had achieved something far more valuable than a direct hit. The Chikuma had turned away from the American carriers, breaking off her attack run. The heavy cruiser was now heading northwest, away from Taffy 3, losing 5 critical minutes of pursuit time. 5 minutes that allowed the slow-moving escort carriers to flee south, inching closer to potential rescue from Halsey's fleet. At 7:45 a.m., the Roberts emerged from the smokescreen to find that Chikuma had completed her turn and was resuming her course toward the carriers. Now 8,000 yards away, the cruiser was out of torpedo range, so Copeland ordered Burton to open fire with a forward 5-inch gun. The mount rotated toward the target, its barrel elevating to maximum range, as Burton shouted, "Fire!" The first shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second, arcing high into the sky before plummeting toward the Chikuma. But it landed 400 yards short, sending a spray of water into the air. "Adjust elevation," Burton barked. The crew moved quickly, and the second shot fell 200 yards short. The third shot splashed near the Chikuma's bow. Then on the fourth shot, there was a flash of light and a cloud of smoke. A direct hit. The shell struck the cruiser's forward superstructure, penetrating the armor and detonating inside, sending thick black smoke billowing from the impact point. "Good hit," Burton shouted. "Keep firing." Burton's crew settled into a relentless rhythm. Load, ram, fire. Load, ram, fire. 15 rounds per minute, the gun barrel growing hotter by the second, the recoil mechanism cycling with a loud clank each time. Brass casings piled up inside the mount, crunching under the crew's boots as the smell of gunpowder filled the air. After 5 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had expended 75 rounds, 5% of their total ammunition, and scored several more hits on the Chikuma, though it was impossible to gauge the full extent of the damage. The cruiser kept firing back, her 8-inch shells landing closer and closer to the Roberts, the blast shaking the ship to its core. At 7:52 a.m., the Chikuma shifted its fire from the carriers to the Roberts, focusing its full firepower on the tiny destroyer Escort. 8-inch shells began landing perilously close, 30 yards to port, shrapnel peppering the hull and slicing through rigging, 20 yards to starboard, the blast wave knocking sailors off their feet, 10 yards off the bow, the splash drenching the forward gun mount, seawater pouring through the gun ports and sloshing around the crew's feet. But Burton's men didn't stop firing. The gun mechanism was built to function wet. Destroyers operated in all weather, all sea states, and the crew had trained for simulated flooding. This was no simulation, though. This was war, and every round they fired was a chance to keep the carriers safe. Elsewhere on the battlefield, the situation was growing dire. At 8:03 a.m., the destroyer Johnston took a devastating hit from the Congo, a 14-inch shell that struck its bridge directly, killing the executive officer and wounding the captain. The Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots, and steering control shifted to the aft station. But the destroyer kept fighting, its guns still blazing. 3 miles to the north, the destroyer Howell was locked in combat with the heavy cruiser Haguro, already crippled by multiple hits. Its forward gun mount destroyed, its number 3 engine room flooded, limping along at 15 knots on a single engine. The Roberts remained intact, still roaring along at 28 knots and firing at the Chikuma. But ammunition was running dangerously low. After 18 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had used 270 rounds from the forward gun, 90% of its supply, leaving just 34 rounds remaining, enough for 2 minutes and 16 seconds of fire at their current rate. At 8:07 a.m., Copeland ordered Burton to shift targets to the heavy cruiser Tone, which had closed to 7,000 yards closer than the Chikuma and far more dangerous, armed with 8 8-inch guns and firing relentlessly at the escort carrier Gambier Bay. Shells were landing around the Gambier Bay, getting closer with each salvo, and Copeland knew the carrier couldn't survive much longer. Burton traversed the gun mount to the new bearing, elevated for 7,000 yards, and fired. The first shot fell short, but the second hit true, striking the Tone's number 2 turret, piercing its armored face and detonating inside. The turret seized up, unable to rotate or fire. Burton had disabled a quarter of the cruiser's main battery with a 5-inch gun, a weapon never designed to damage heavy cruisers. "Great shot," Copeland shouted over the intercom. But seconds later, at 8:10 a.m., the forward gun fired its last round. 304 rounds expended, the barrel glowing dull red, the recoil mechanism on the verge of failure, springs compressed beyond their limits, oil smoking in the recuperator. Burton's crew had pushed the gun past every Navy specification, and now it was spent. The aft gun mount, manned by gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, still had ammunition, 325 rounds. The 20-year-old from Chickasha, Oklahoma, had joined the Navy in May 1942, trained at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, and been assigned to the Roberts 6 months prior. This was his first surface action. His 10-man crew, average age 21, had been firing continuously since 7:45 a.m. 25 minutes of nonstop combat, expending 324 rounds, leaving just one last shell. They were exhausted, their arms aching, their faces streaked with sweat and soot, but they kept firing, their eyes fixed on the enemy. At 8:15 a.m., the Roberts' luck ran out. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Chikuma to the north, Tone to the northeast, and Haguro to the northwest, had her bracketed, closing in relentlessly. 6,000 yards, 5,000, 4,000. The Roberts was running out of sea room, running out of smoke to hide in, running out of time. At 8:20 a.m., an 8-inch shell from the Chikuma struck the Roberts' portside amidships, piercing the thin hull plating, tearing through the galley, and exiting the starboard side without detonating, leaving a 3-foot-wide hole in its wake. Seawater began flooding the lower decks, and the ship listed 5 degrees to port. Damage control teams raced to the breach, stuffing mattresses and blankets into the hole, shoring up buckled bulkheads with wooden planks, their hands raw from the effort. But the water kept coming. 2 minutes later, a second shell hit, this one detonating. The explosion tore through the crew's berthing compartment, killing 6 men instantly, their bodies thrown across the room. Steam lines ruptured, superheated steam filling the passageways, scalding 4 more sailors who screamed in agony as their skin blistered. The Roberts' speed dropped to 24 knots, then 20. One boiler went offline, and Trowbridge fought desperately to keep the other running, his face black with soot, his lungs burning from the smoke. Elsewhere on the battlefield, the situation was growing dire. At 8:03 a.m., the destroyer Johnston took a devastating hit from the Congo, a 14-inch shell that struck its bridge directly, killing the executive officer and wounding the captain. The Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots and steering control shifted to the aft station. But the destroyer kept fighting, its guns still blazing. 3 miles to the north, the destroyer Howell was locked in combat with the heavy cruiser Haguro, already crippled by multiple hits. Its forward gun mount destroyed, its number 3 engine room flooded, limping along at 15 knots on a single engine. The Roberts remained intact, still roaring along at 28 knots and firing at the Chikuma. But ammunition was running dangerously low. After 18 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had used 270 rounds from the forward gun, 90% of its supply, leaving just 34 rounds remaining, enough for 2 minutes and 16 seconds of fire at their current rate. At 8:07 a.m., Copeland ordered Burton to shift targets to the heavy cruiser Tone, which had closed to 7,000 yards closer than the Chikuma and far more dangerous, armed with 8 8-inch guns and firing relentlessly at the escort carrier Gambier Bay. Shells were landing around the Gambier Bay, getting closer with each salvo, and Copeland knew the carrier couldn't survive much longer. Burton traversed the gun mount to the new bearing, elevated for 7,000 yards, and fired. The first shot fell short, but the second hit true, striking the Tone's number 2 turret, piercing its armored face and detonating inside. The turret seized up, unable to rotate or fire. Burton had disabled a quarter of the cruiser's main battery with a 5-inch gun, a weapon never designed to damage heavy cruisers. "Great shot," Copeland shouted over the intercom. But seconds later, at 8:10 a.m., the forward gun fired its last round. 304 rounds expended, the barrel glowing dull red, the recoil mechanism on the verge of failure, springs compressed beyond their limits, oil smoking in the recuperator. Burton's crew had pushed the gun past every Navy specification, and now it was spent. The aft gun mount, manned by gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, still had ammunition, 325 rounds. The 20-year-old from Chickasha, Oklahoma, had joined the Navy in May 1942, trained at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, and been assigned to the Roberts 6 months prior. This was his first surface action. His 10-man crew, average age 21, had been firing continuously since 7:45 a.m. 25 minutes of nonstop combat, expending 324 rounds, leaving just one last shell. They were exhausted, their arms aching, their faces streaked with sweat and soot, but they kept firing, their eyes fixed on the enemy. At 8:15 a.m., the Roberts' luck ran out. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Chikuma to the north, Tone to the northeast, and Haguro to the northwest, had her bracketed, closing in relentlessly. 6,000 yards, 5,000, 4,000. The Roberts was running out of sea room, running out of smoke to hide in, running out of time. At 8:20 a.m., an 8-inch shell from the Chikuma struck the Roberts' portside amidships, piercing the thin hull plating, tearing through the galley, and exiting the starboard side without detonating, leaving a 3-foot-wide hole in its wake. Seawater began flooding the lower decks, and the ship listed 5 degrees to port. Damage control teams raced to the breach, stuffing mattresses and blankets into the hole, shoring up buckled bulkheads with wooden planks, their hands raw from the effort. But the water kept coming. 2 minutes later, a second shell hit, this one detonating. The explosion tore through the crew's berthing compartment, killing 6 men instantly, their bodies thrown across the room. Steam lines ruptured, superheated steam filling the passageways, scalding 4 more sailors who screamed in agony as their skin blistered. The Roberts' speed dropped to 24 knots, then 20. One boiler went offline, and Trowbridge fought desperately to keep the other running, his face black with soot, his lungs burning from the smoke. At 8:25 a.m., the aft gun mount lost electrical power. The power train that rotated the mount, the hydraulic ram that loaded shells, the firing mechanism, all went dead. But Carr's crew was trained for this. Every destroyer escort crew drilled for combat damage, learning to operate the gun manually if needed. It was grueling work. The trainer and pointer cranked the mount by hand to aim, their muscles burning with each turn. The loader and rammer lifted 54-pound shells manually, slamming them into the breach with all their strength. The gun captain triggered the firing pin by hand. The rate of fire dropped from 15 rounds per minute to 6 or 7, but they kept firing, their determination unbroken. The gun barrel glowed red-hot, heat radiating through the mount, the temperature inside soaring to 130 degrees. The crew was soaked, sweat, seawater from near misses, steam from ruptured lines, but they didn't stop. At 8:30 a.m., disaster struck the aft mount. A powder charge cooked off, ignited by the overheated breech. The explosion tore through the mount, killing 3 men instantly and wounding 7 others, shrapnel shredding the interior. The blast threw Carr backward against the bulkhead, a jagged piece of steel slicing him from neck to groin, his intestines exposed. He fell to the deck, bleeding heavily, but he wasn't finished. He spotted the last remaining shell on the ammunition rack, 54 pounds of steel, the Roberts' final shot, and began crawling toward it, his hands slipping in his own blood. He grabbed the shell, clutching it to his chest, and looked at his crew, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Load it! Keep firing!" Machinist's mate second class, Chalmer Gohan, found him, gently taking the shell from his hands and trying to drag him to safety. But Carr refused to move, pointing frantically at the gun. Gohan set the shell down, pulled Carr away from the destroyed mount, and held him as he died 5 minutes later, still staring at the enemy. At 8:35 a.m., a 14-inch shell, either from the Congo or Haruna, struck the Roberts' starboard side, penetrating the number 2 engine room and detonating inside. The explosion tore a 40-foot-long, 10-foot-wide hole in the hull, seawater flooding the engine room in 30 seconds, killing 8 men instantly. The Roberts' speed dropped to 10 knots, then 5, then nothing. Dead in the water, no power, no steering, 3 feet of water in the lower decks, fires burning in 4 compartments, settling stern first into the Philippine Sea. Copeland ordered all remaining crew topside. Abandon ship, abandon ship. 115 men were already dead or missing. The remaining 109 sailors climbed over the side, jumping into the water. They had 3 inflatable life rafts, 2 destroyed by shell fire, 1 left designed for 16 men. So they loaded the wounded aboard, while everyone else clung to floater nets, debris, empty shell casings, anything that would keep them afloat. At 9:35 a.m., the Roberts rolled to port, her bow rising into the sky like a final salute, then slipped beneath the waves, stern first, sinking to 3,600 feet, 600 fathoms. The deepest any American warship had been sunk in combat at the time. The 109 survivors drifted in the water for 50 long hours, their ordeal far from over. They were covered in thick black fuel oil from the Roberts' ruptured tanks, the oil stinging their eyes, filling their mouths, coating their lungs, leaving some vomiting uncontrollably, others unconscious. The water temperature was 84 degrees, warm enough to survive for a while, but they had no food, no fresh water, no rescue in sight. Sharks arrived at 2 p.m. on October 25th. Small blacktip reef sharks at first, circling the men, bumping them cautiously, then larger tiger sharks and bull sharks. More aggressive, their fins cutting through the water as they closed in. 2 men disappeared during the first night, their fates unspoken but clear. Night brought cold, the water temperature dropping to 78 degrees, hypothermia setting in for the wounded. 3 more died from their injuries and exposure. October 26th brought scorching sun and dehydration, men hallucinating rescue ships and land, 5 more losing their lives. Through it all, Copeland kept his men together, his voice steady as he organized them into groups, assigned leaders, and made them count off every hour. "Stay awake," he shouted. "Falling asleep means drowning." He shook men who drifted off, talked to them about their families, their homes, anything to keep them focused. 14 men died over 3 days, but 95 survived, thanks to his unwavering resolve. At 7:45 a.m. on October 27th, the patrol craft PC-1119 spotted the survivors, escorting 5 landing craft infantry north of Samar. The lookout saw wreckage, bodies, then life jackets, and the PC approached cautiously. Japanese survivors were known to feign death and attack rescuers. The craft stopped 50 yards away and called out a test. "Who won the World Series?" An American voice yelled back, "St. Louis Cardinals." The tension broke and rescue operations began, taking 4 hours to pull 95 men from the water. Some couldn't walk, couldn't stand, and were carried aboard, all treated for dehydration, burns, wounds, infections, and fuel oil poisoning. The most severe cases were transferred to the hospital ship Comfort and taken to Hollandia. The rest were sent to Leyte, then to San Francisco aboard the transport Lurline, arriving on December 4th, 3 weeks before Christmas. The Battle off Samar would go down in history as the greatest last stand in naval warfare. 7 small ships turning back 23 warships, saving an entire invasion fleet, and robbing Japan of its last chance to halt the Philippine campaign, potentially shortening the Pacific War by months. Admiral Chester Nimitz called it the Navy's finest hour. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote that no engagement in naval history showed more gallantry. The Roberts was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, Copeland the Navy Cross, and Paul Carr the Silver Star, posthumously. In 1982, the Navy commissioned the guided missile frigate USS Copeland. In 1985, the USS Carr joined the fleet, named for the young gunner who died clutching his last shell. In June 2022, explorer Victor Vescovo discovered the Roberts at a depth of 22,621 feet, 4.3 miles, the deepest shipwreck ever found, deeper than the Titanic. The wreck sits upright, its bow separated from the stern by the impact, but recognizable. The aft gun mount where Paul Carr died is still there, silent and solemn, a testament to the courage of the men who served aboard her. The last survivor of the Roberts, Alfred Leonore, died on March 20th, 2022, at the age of 97, 3 months before his ship was found. This is the story of the destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship, the tiny ship that charged the Yamato, the crew that refused to surrender even when survival was impossible. Their courage, their sacrifice, their unwavering duty to one another and to their country will never be forgotten. If this story moved you, hit the like button to honor their memory. Subscribe to keep these forgotten heroes alive. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you have family who served in World War II, share their story. We read every comment. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.